So again, welcome to our wild webcast on the fight against chronic wasting disease. We're joined by our two experts, Jasmine Batten and Jason Sumners. So we thank you for joining us. And we also thank our webcast participants for joining us and bearing with our little bit of technical difficulty here. We appreciate your time and interest in this important topic. So again, here's what to expect. We'll start with a conversation with Jason and Jasmine on a serious threat to Missouri deer and deer hunting called chronic wasting disease, or CWD. Jasmine and Jason will go over some important information about CWD, talk about what we'll be doing with upcoming mandatory sampling for areas in northeast, central, and east central Missouri, and also share what hunters and others can do to help find and limit the deadly disease. We will then open the discussion up to questions from you, our webcast participants. So please share your questions by using the chat box on the right side of your screen, and be sure to use all participants. So let's get to know Jasmine and Jason a little bit better. Jasmine is a wildlife disease biologist. She has nearly 8 years of experience in the field. She began her career with the department in June of 2013 as our wildlife health specialist. In May of this year, she was promoted to our wildlife disease coordinator, and as that, Jasmine spends a lot of time focusing on chronic wasting disease. Do you agree?
Absolutely. I've been called the CWD queen of MDC before.
Good to have you. Jasmine graduated from the University of Wisconsin at Madison with a bachelor's degree in natural resources, and then before joining MDC, she worked on a variety of wildlife disease concerns, including chronic wasting disease, or CWD, in Wisconsin. So again, thank you for being here today.
Thank you.
And Jason is the Wildlife Division Chief for the department. He has a bachelor's degree in fisheries and wildlife from the University of Missouri and a master's degree in biology from Mississippi State University. He joined MDC in 2008 as a biologist focused on private lands deer management. In 2011, he assumed the role of our state deer biologist, and then he was promoted to his current role as chief of our wildlife division in the fall of 2015. When not working, Jason enjoys spending time with his family in the great outdoors. Again, thank you for being here, Jason. So Jasmine, why don't you tell us a bit more about this deadly disease?
Sure. So chronic wasting disease, or CWD, is a neurodegenerative disease that affects members of the deer family. It is pretty unique in the fact that it belongs to a unique category of diseases called TSCs. So it's very different from the bacteria and viruses that most of us are familiar with. It is an infectious disease, so it does spread from deer to deer. And the way that disease spreads is through an abnormal protein called a prion. So basically, an infected deer can shed these abnormal proteins, again called prions, through body fluids such as saliva, urine, or feces. And a healthy deer can come into contact with that prion either through direct deer contact or, unfortunately, through environmental contamination as well. So what that means is infected deer shed these prions into the environment, and other deer can come into contact with contaminated soil, water, or food source. It is a lethal disease, meaning that it does kill any animal that it infects. And unfortunately, at this point in time, there is no vaccine or treatment or cure for the disease. It primarily moves and spreads across the landscape by deer movement. And when we say deer movement, we mean a few things here. It could be normal and natural deer dispersal. This is particularly a concern for yearling male deer that disperse the greatest distances when they're looking for new home range. So an infected animal can disperse and bring the disease to an otherwise uninfected area. Deer movement could also mean carcass movement. So if a hunter harvests an infected deer from, say, up in Macon County, where we know the disease is more established, if they take that carcass and throw it on the landscape somewhere else in the state, the disease can spread that way. And additionally, deer movement could mean the movement of captive animals, either legally or illegally. The rate of spread of the disease is primarily affected by how many infected deer there are in the landscape. So what that means is the greater the number of infected deer, the faster the growth of the disease is gonna occur.
Good information. Thank you. It's good to know. Jason, would you tell us a bit more about what Jasmine's talking about as far as how the disease spreads over time?
Yeah, so as Jasmine indicated, the primary mode of transmission of the disease, especially early in states of infection, is direct deer-to-deer contact. And so as more of those deer become infected on a landscape, the more they will infect deer. So what you end up with is a typical exponential growth in prevalence. So this graph shows kind of the epicenter of the outbreak of CWD in Wisconsin, a location where it was identified in 2002. And then you see there in adult males, prevalence is approximately 2 or 3%. And by 2015, prevalence in adult males had increased to more than 45%. The other thing this graph shows is the difference in prevalence rates that we see between bucks and does. Bucks, based on breeding behavior, interact with numerous other males, as well as a lot of female social groups, and so they present an opportunity to become infected at a much higher rate. Females typically only interact with females in their social group, or females that occur in a social group that overlaps their home range, and so they tend to increase in prevalence a little slower.
Okay, and prevalence again is?
Prevalence is the proportion of animals in the population that have the disease. Okay. So most of this stuff is done through hunter-harvest surveillance, so the percentage of the samples that they have collected that are positive.
Okay, good to know. Thank you.
And so what happens is this disease accumulates over time. It begins to be lethal, and so that begins to be unsustainable within the population. So this graph is actually some good data that's been collected over the long term from Wyoming on mule deer. And what you see in orange there is the increasing prevalence rates from 2001 to 2013. That coincided with a subsequent decline in the population, the green bar there, from approximately 15,000 deer in this herd to just over 5,000 deer in the herd. And so what happens, you kind of reach a tipping point where these animals, as Jasmine mentioned earlier, is 100% lethal, and so there becomes a point at which the population can no longer sustain itself. And so this data shows mule deer definitely affected the size of the herd, decreased it. They recently published some information on whitetail deer in the same area showing a very similar trend.
Okay, so eventually CWD can lead to a lot fewer deer, and then the deer that remain will tend to be younger and less experienced in both surviving and reproducing.
Yeah, what we find is the disease, it tends to attack individuals in older ages. Part of that, the time at which it takes for the disease to kill an animal, but then the time to exposure. So there's opportunity for a deer to actually come in contact with another infected animal. So what you have is a cropping off of the older individuals within the population, which results in a younger population, and then it results in younger does having to be the producers of the population, and they tend to be less productive. They tend to have fewer fawns. Those fawns tend to have lower survival. And so it's kind of a compounding effect.
Yeah, it's kind of disturbing. Let's go to a quick quiz, folks. So I know, what do you think? Which buck has chronic wasting disease? And we'll be quick about it. Jasmine, what's the answer?
So the answer is both, and more so than trick you all out there, the purpose of this slide is to really demonstrate a really important characteristic of CWD that is important to understand, and that is that it is a very slowly progressive disease. From the time that a deer comes in contact with the disease, is exposed, it can take up to a year or longer for it to show symptoms. So, you know, that deer on the right is healthy, it was hunter harvested, but it was in fact positive for the disease. And if it hadn't been harvested, it would have progressed until the point of showing symptoms.
Okay, what are some of those symptoms?
So overall, a deer, once it starts to show signs of CWD, is going to just be in poor body condition overall. It's going to lose weight to the point of looking emaciated. It's possibly going to have dull or ragged hair. You know, we mentioned earlier that it's a neurodegenerative disease, so it's going to have some sort of neurological symptoms which will manifest as odd behavior. It might do things like show repetitive motion, lose fear of humans. I've heard reports of CWD positive deer acting aggressively towards dogs or other pets. At the same time, you might see the animals with excessive salivation, excessive urination, and those are really bad things in terms of disease transmission, because that salivation, urination is shedding those prions that spread the disease and further spreading it to other animals. It's important to note these symptoms aren't unique exclusively to chronic wasting disease. So it is difficult to look at an animal that's sick and know definitively that it has the disease. There's a lot of reasons that deer lose weight, but really that decline in body condition coupled with abnormal behavior is what we're going to see.
And here's some more, frankly, disturbing pictures.
Yeah, these are all deer that tested positive for chronic wasting disease. The animal on the left side of the screen did come from Macon County, so right here in Missouri. The animal down on the bottom right was a deer from Wisconsin, and that one's kind of an interesting story. It was observed wandering around for a few days in a small town in Wisconsin, southern Wisconsin, in the area where the disease is quite prevalent. It was observed, and a couple days later, it was found dead. Subsequently, it got tested for chronic wasting disease, and it was apparent that this is an animal that died from the disease.
And that's a really important point, I think, to mention, because a lot of folks, well, not a lot, but some folks claim that CWD hasn't actually really ever killed deer, but we have really proof now that says it does actually eventually kill deer.
Yes, again, it can take quite some time, and those animals can be infected and look healthy, but if they're not dying from a hunter or a deer or a car collision, this is what really is going to happen to them.
Okay. Wow. Some disturbing pictures. So, Jason, where did this disease come from, and how was it spread?
Yeah, so the disease was first identified in a captive mule deer population, a research facility in northeastern Colorado. It was subsequently found in the free-ranging population in the 1980s, again, there in northeastern Colorado. Over time, the disease has spread. We look at the current distribution now, you can see a pretty rapid expansion of the disease over the last couple of decades. What the graph shows is the yellow dots and red dots are captive facilities that have tested positive for the disease, and then the grayed out boxes are counties or management units in which the disease has been found in the free-ranging population. So it's been a pretty significant expansion in the disease across much of the units.
And when did CWD first hit Missouri, and how bad is it here?
So CWD at this point in time has been found in kind of north central, and east central Missouri. Our first case occurred in 2010 in a captive facility in Linn County. 2011, we found 10 additional positives in a captive facility in Macon County. Our first free-ranging positives were found in the winter of 2012, just outside of that Macon County facility. And so to date, we've had 33 free-ranging positive deer for CWD, 21 of those in Macon County, 9 in Adair, 1 in Cole, 1 in Franklin, and then recently 1 in Linn County.
All right. Tell us about the area that we've designated as the CWD management zone, and then we'll talk a bit about the mandatory testing that's coming up.
So we define CWD management zone in an effort to try to limit and slow the spread of the disease. The zone is established as a 25-mile, any county that falls within 25 miles of a known CWD positive. And so to date, that includes 29 counties. Again, most of them in north central, and then east central Missouri. And so as part of that, we're going to implement mandatory sampling in those counties on opening weekend of the firearms season. So we're asking hunters to bring deer that are harvested on opening weekend, so that's November 12th and 13th, to a check station at a designated sampling station, either the whole carcass or at least the head with 6 inches attached. And this is a really important effort in terms of trying to determine the distribution of the disease and then detect any sparks that might occur out there so we can implement some management to control the disease a little more quickly. And so we think this additional sampling effort should result in somewhere between 18 and 20,000 samples.
Okay. And again, you mentioned we will have 75 sampling stations throughout the 29 counties, and it's going to be a very busy weekend just for staff and for hunters. Jason, any tips to help it go as quickly as possible for hunters?
Yeah, so for most folks, it'll still seem, like to the old days of the check stations. I think it's important to remind folks that these are not check stations, they're CWD sampling stations, so the telecheck requirements still stand. So we're asking folks to telecheck their deer before they arrive at the sampling location, and then have their permit ready. We're going to ask for name, we're going to ask for a contact information, a phone number, and we're going to ask for the conservation ID number. That's going to be used so they can look up their test results on the website. We're also going to ask them to map the location, so be prepared to identify where you took the deer at on a map, which especially folks who don't necessarily live where they hunt, that can sometimes be a challenge. So spend some time being able to identify the location. Another thing that'll help make the process go a little more quickly is to position the deer in the back of the truck or wherever in a way that we can get to it quickly. So, the head back towards the tailgate, we'll just drop the tailgate, slide the heads out, and be able to sample them pretty quickly. Hunters do have the option of just bringing in the head with 6 inches attached, which would be a nice option too. Then we can just take the head and pull the samples out. We ask for 6 inches attached to the neck so that we ensure that the samples are still there, because they occur right there at the base of the neck and the skull. So those things can help kind of speed up the process. We ask folks to just be patient with us as we work through it.
Good. So, Jasmine, we're talking about CWD sampling. What's really involved with that?
So the process of collecting a CWD sample is relatively a quick process. What we're doing is removing a particular set of lymph nodes that occur in the region between the head and the neck of the deer. So staff is going to make a big incision on the throat of your deer to remove those lymph nodes for the testing. We'll package those samples up, we'll label them, we send them off to an independent lab that specializes in disease testing. And it's important to note that our staff will also be collecting a bit of data from each deer that comes to the station. They'll be filling out a data sheet. So we will be asking hunters as part of that data collection process to identify the location of the harvest of your deer. That's really important to understand sample distribution as we're looking at our results down the road. And a final important note is that hunters will be able to access test results for free from their deer. They'll simply be able to go to our website, type in their conservation ID number, and see what the results from their deer were.
Okay, good to know. And again, folks, sampling locations and other details are listed in our 2016 Fall Deer and Turkey Hunting Regulations and Information Booklet, and you can get that wherever permits are sold and also online at mdc.mo.gov/CWD. Jasmine, tell us a bit more why we're doing the mandatory sampling.
Yeah, so Jason kind of touched on this already, but we have two main goals of this mandatory sampling effort. The first is to dramatically increase our sample size for the year. Last year we tested about 7,500 deer in the state, and this year we're looking at testing as many as 20,000 or possibly more through the mandatory sampling effort and additional sampling that's happening. These samples are really important in order to better understand the distribution of the disease, that is where it's occurring on the landscape, and the prevalence, meaning how many deer are out there. Additionally, the second goal of this effort is to help us find sparks out there, meaning areas of the management zone where the disease has spread to. We do believe that CWD is relatively rare in the state at this point in time, and detecting a rare disease is extremely difficult. You need to test a whole lot of animals to find that disease, so this sample size is going to help us do that.
Well, thank you. Jason, what do you think? Are we going to do mandatory sampling in future years?
I think that's yet to be determined. Ultimately, it'll be decided upon how this year's efforts go and what the results tell us. We have done a lot of critical thinking about what some of the alternatives might be and what path we might go down, but ultimately the results of the testing will tell us what's going on.
Very good, thank you. So again, why opening weekend?
Opening weekend is the most popular 2 days of hunting. It's when a third of our total deer harvest will occur. So we'll shoot 270,000 deer plus statewide on an annual basis, and about 90,000 of those will be taken on those 2 days. And so within the CWD management zone, we'll probably shoot 75 or 80,000 during the entire hunting season, with probably 25,000 of those taken on that opening weekend. So it's our best opportunity to get a large number of samples, and as Jasmine indicated, get a good geographic distribution that tells us what's going on.
So we really need hunter help to make this happen.
We do, and that's one of the things we commonly hear is hunters ask us, how can they help? Well, this, yeah, may be a bit of an inconvenience asking folks to bring a deer in, but it is one of the things that will give us the best idea as to what actually is going on the landscape.
So what else could people do to help limit CWD?
Yeah, so again, having deer harvested in the CWD management zone, whether that's during the hunting season or if, during opening weekend, or if that's following the hunting season or following opening weekend. We also have made a number of regulation changes that restrict the placement of food, salt, and minerals, those things that concentrate deer and promote the transmission of the disease. That picture of the doe that we saw earlier in a salt lick, actually, one of the first CWD positive animals in Macon County. So the concentration of those animals promotes the spread of the disease. Again, asking folks not to move carcasses outside the CWD management zone. That infectious material in the brain and spinal cord improperly disposed of in another location is a way that we could introduce the disease to a new spot. And then we ask people to report sick deer to their local conservation agent or to the MDC office. That's the way the disease has been detected in a few spots, and they give us the opportunity maybe to detect it in a new spot a little bit quicker.
Okay, Jason and Jasmine, again, thank you for some great information. Folks, that's really kind of the presentation part of this. So we want you to share your questions using the chat box on the right side of your screen, and be sure to use all participants. So let's start with some questions. Doug wants to know, what if a hunter harvests a buck? Will we still take samples?
So sampling bucks is very important, as Jason kind of alluded to earlier. Adult males, the prevalence is higher, so those are very valuable samples to us. However, if you have harvested a buck that you want to shoulder mount and are taken to a taxidermist, as I mentioned, the incision that we're going to make is a large incision across the neck, and that does ruin the cape of your animal. So if you're going to take your animal to a taxidermist, you still need to come to a sampling station. That is what the regulation states, that you need to present it for testing. Be sure to inform our staff that that is an animal that's going to a taxidermist. We will be able to record some data from you, verify that you came there, and send you along your way without ruining that cape. And at that point, if you do still wish to get your deer sampled, we do have a number of ways you can do that. You can go to a participating taxidermist that can mount your deer and take the sample. You can get the head back from a taxidermist after it's caped out and get it to an MDC office.
Okay. Yeah, we were pretty careful in the way we wrote the regulation to clearly state that the deer was to be presented. The sampling isn't mandatory, but presenting the deer for the opportunity to be sampled, recognizing that some folks would shoot nice bucks that they want to get a shoulder mount. And we're cooperating with lots and lots of taxidermists throughout the CWD management zone. So many of those samples will get collected even if we don't collect it on one of our sampling stations.
So what if a hunter shoots a buck and shoots a deer and can't make it to a sampling station before 8 o'clock, about when they close?
We would handle that the same way we would handle a hunter shooting one that doesn't recover it until after 10 o'clock. You know, tail-check requirements say that the deer's got to be checked by 10 o'clock. And so you handle that by contacting your local conservation agent and explaining to them the situation. Just simple, quick call and tell them what's going on.
Okay. And Jasmine, so if a hunter processes his or her deer in the field, what do they need to do to submit a sample?
You can either bring us the whole carcass, or if you're processing that animal out in the field, it's acceptable to just bring the head as long as you leave approximately 6 inches of the neck in place. Bag that up, bring it to us, and that's acceptable. Just a note so that folks are aware, the regulation does require that the person that harvested the deer actually presents it to us.
Okay, and what about having deer tested before or after opening weekend?
So if your deer is harvested in a CWD management zone county, we do have opportunities for hunters to get a deer tested throughout the entirety of our firearms season. You can either take it to one of our participating regional offices that are able to collect a sample during normal business hours, or you can take it to a participating non-MDC cooperator. We have a number of taxidermists, as Jason mentioned. Those locations are listed on our MDC website, and they should be able to get a sample for you.
Okay, what about deer that are harvested outside of the CWD management zone?
So in terms of kind of hunter request, hunter service testing, that's really only offered for folks that are hunting in the CWD management zone. We are testing deer throughout the entire state, but our greatest number of samples are coming from those management zones. So really the hunter service testing is available in areas in and near where we found the disease. So again, that's 29 counties in the management zone. Additionally, we do have some opportunities for hunters in select counties near the Missouri and Arkansas border.
Why don't you tell us a bit more about what's going on down there?
Yeah, so last February, Arkansas detected CWD for the first time in the northwest part of their state. As a result, they did some follow-up testing and to date found over 100 CWD infected animals. So for that reason, we are concerned with monitoring CWD along our border counties. So in Berry, Christian, Douglas, McDonald, Ozark, Stone, and Taney counties, we will have some opportunities for hunters to get deer sampled. We'll have a number of MDC staff at meat processors opening weekend. We also have 2 of our regional offices available to take your deer to get tested. And we have a number of participating taxidermists down there as well that can collect samples for you.
Okay, and to be clear, have any deer in southern Missouri tested positive?
To date, no deer in southern Missouri have tested positive for the disease.
Jason, what about hunters who harvest deer or other cervids such as elk out of state and then bring them back to Missouri? What do they need to know?
Yeah, so this is an active time. Folks are heading to Colorado, Wyoming, shooting elk, shooting mule deer, those kinds of things. We do have a rule that requires anybody who brings back a whole intact cervid, so a deer, an elk, or a moose to the state, they must report that entry within 24 hours, and we have the phone number listed there, or they can go online and report it at mdc.mo.gov/carcass. And so what the rule requires is for them to be reported, and then within 72 hours to actually be taken to a processor or a taxidermist. Now, if folks are just passing through the state, the rule doesn't apply, as long as the carcass isn't going to stay here for more than 24 hours. And it's also important to note that the rule really only applies to whole carcasses or carcasses that come in with the head and spine attached. So again, like we talked, that infectious material, the brain tissue. So folks bringing back quartered out animals have been caped, that have got a clean skull cap, or they've already boiled out the skull. Those kinds of things do not require reporting, and all of that can be found in the fall deer and turkey booklet, the specifics of what's allowed.
Good to know. Thank you. Hey, Jasmine, can CWD be eliminated?
Unfortunately, CWD is a very challenging disease, and what we're seeing based on how the disease spreads and what's happening in other states is once it's well established, it's at this point, based on current knowledge, very unlikely to eliminate it. For that reason, MDC is putting a big focus on slowing the spread of the disease outside of areas where it occurs, and we're doing a lot of prevention to prevent it from showing up in currently unaffected areas of the state.
All right, and Jason or Jasmine, we'll keep it with you here. Some folks are asking, could CWD have just always been here and we not know about it?
So our research strongly suggests that the disease has not always been in the state of Missouri. We began testing deer in the state in 2002. To date, we've tested over 51,000 animals. Based on what we know about how the disease spreads and grows in prevalence and distribution, based on the few number of CWD positive deer that we've found to date and the limited locations in the state where it's found, it's very, very unlikely that this disease has always been here, and it's most likely a relatively recent introduction.
And again, folks, thank you. Please continue to share your questions using all participants. We have a long list that we're going to try to get through here, so we appreciate you participating. Jason, this also, Randy wants to know, so why does MDC then go and shoot more or most deer in areas where the disease has been found?
Well, we know really 3 things about the disease. It kills deer. Once it's on the landscape, it increases in prevalence and it increases in distribution. And so the way that we limit the spread of the disease is try to remove deer in the immediate area where infected animals are. Like we talked about, it's transmitted directly from deer to deer, and so the cases of the disease are very clumped on the landscape. And so following the hunting season, we have implemented some additional targeted culling efforts, but those primarily occurring on private land and voluntary participation of the landowners. They're also occurring in very, very small areas. So, for example, within Macon County, the vast majority of the additional removals that we've done has been within a 30 square mile area. Essentially, we draw a 1 or 2 square mile buffer around the CWD positive animals, and that's where we target those social groups that are the individuals that actually have the disease and are most likely to transmit it to one another.
So this applies, I think. Keith wants to know, what does MDC do when they find an area with deer that have CWD?
Yeah, so a big part of that has been additional sampling, trying to determine the prevalence and distribution. So our path at this point has been to draw initially a 5-mile radius around it, have a sample objective to determine what the distribution of the disease is. Once we identify a small little core area, then, as I mentioned, target that very, very small population. What our mandatory sampling is going to allow us to do is have a better idea of what that true distribution is, and then actually target the locations where we have positive deer. So when we talk about those targeted removals, it's really just trying to remove the deer in that social group that was infected or in those neighboring social groups. So very, very small targeted efforts.
Okay. Another question we get a lot, and Mark wants to know, how will eating the meat from an infected deer affect humans? So, Jasmine, can CWD be transmitted to people or even pets?
So to date, based on current research, CWD is a disease that's only affecting members of the deer family, and it's not transmissible, according to current research, to any species, including humans, besides deer. For hunters that are concerned about possible exposure to CWD, the Center for Disease Control and Prevention would recommend that if you're hunting in an area that you know have the disease, you can get your deer tested. If it tests positive, you could avoid eating that animal. In general, though, the CDC recommends not eating deer that look sick and wearing gloves when you're processing game. But I would just encourage folks that are concerned about that issue to realize that CWD is pretty limited in distribution in the state.
Okay, we had someone ask to show the clinical signs of CWD again, so we're putting that back on the screen. And while we have that up there, Dennis wants to know, if he has a sick-looking deer on his trail cam, what should he do?
So you can report that to your local MDC office or your local conservation agent. At times folks send us pictures and we can kind of do our best guess to see what that looks like.
Good. Jason, another question that Gary wants to know is, can't this all just be blue tongue? So can you tell us a bit what the difference is between chronic wasting disease and hemorrhagic disease, which is also referred to as HD or blue tongue?
Yeah, so these two diseases are commonly confused from one another. They're completely different diseases. The big point here is that we know CWD is always fatal. Once it becomes established, it doesn't go away. Hemorrhagic disease is not always fatal. Yeah, we can have some significant outbreaks like 2012 where we lose a large proportion of the population in a small area, but it's spread by a biting midgefly. The outbreaks of those midgeflies go away. CWD is spread by that prion, as Jasmine talked earlier, becomes persistent in the environment. It becomes a continual problem throughout the population. And so hemorrhagic disease has been around for a while. It's a virus. We know deer can establish some bit of immunity to that virus and some protection from it. CWD is caused by these prions. It's relatively new to the state. There is no evidence that there's genetic immunity or resistance to the disease at this point, so it's kind of always fatal. Some other important things, hemorrhagic disease outbreaks tend to be very short term. We typically have them in late fall. Those populations can quickly recover. Many of our populations are recovering now from the hemorrhagic outbreak of 2012. And so CWD is one of those that's likely to have some really, really significant long-term impacts. We've had hemorrhagic disease outbreaks for years and years and years, but typically those are very short-term and very localized.
Well, Brad wants to know, is blue tongue more deadly than chronic wasting disease, which is kind of worse?
Well, in the short term, in a local population, a hemorrhagic disease outbreak could be very significant. But when we look at the long term, there's no question that chronic wasting disease is a much more significant disease and one of greater concern to us, because once it becomes established, this thing doesn't go away. It continues to either be persistent in the environment or persistent in the animals. Again, hemorrhagic disease doesn't always kill every deer. Some of them survive it. It can be very short term. And so chronic wasting disease will build up in the population, as has been starting to be demonstrated in Wyoming, and have some really long-term population level impacts.
Okay, so if a deer survives blue tongue or HD, that deer then will build a resistance up?
Yeah, so basically what happens with any virus that an individual gets, even in humans, we develop antibodies that protect us from future infections. The other part that happens when we get outbreaks of hemorrhagic disease, the colostrum that the does actually pass to their future offspring provides them some protection against an outbreak. And so you get these groups of deer that are somewhat immune to it. We can look at across the landscape, southeastern part of the country, we basically get no hemorrhagic disease mortality because it's been persistent. They've developed some immunity to it. There, again, is no resistance or immunity to chronic wasting disease. So every animal that gets infected, unless shot or hit by a car, will eventually succumb to the disease, and it's unlikely to, at this point, for us to see immunity evolve.
Well, building on that, Bill wants to know that if the disease spreads through fluids and direct contact, does that mean that every fawn of an infected doe will then have the disease for certain? And if not, does that mean that some deer are immune or at least resistant to the disease? Either one of you.
Well, there's the research on whether the fawn has a disease when they're born through, the gestation period is somewhat limited. But what we know is that when you look at it, offspring and closely related individuals to an infected female are the ones that are most likely to have the disease. So the social grooming activities that they go through, that doe and her current year's offspring and her previous year's offspring hang out together. And so one way or the other, they're going to expose each other. And again, there just is no evidence that there's any immunity to the disease.
Okay, again, thanks, folks. Keep your questions coming. Christopher wants to know, why isn't the department testing for CWD statewide this year?
So this is a good question. Most of the attention goes to these big, massive efforts that we're doing in these management zone counties, but the department is continuing to test deer statewide. We've been doing this since 2002. We focus on about half of the state each year, so in even years we're looking at deer in the northern half of the state. The way that we're getting those samples in those counties outside of the management zone counties is primarily through hunter harvested deer that taxidermists are sampling for us. So that surveillance is happening each year. It's a lower number of samples compared to the mandatory sampling effort, but we're doing this each and every year because we want to find those new infections as early as we can.
Okay, Jason, Paul wants to know, since CWD has been detected in Arkansas, what's the level of concern for our elk herd down in the Ozarks?
I think at this point in time it's relatively low. We've been doing, as Jasmine indicated earlier, surveillance around the state since 2002. We've collected more than 52,000 deer statewide. We continue to test any of the elk mortalities that we have. We continue to do surveillance around the elk management zone. And so at this point, it's relatively low, and until or unless the disease spreads within the free-range deer population across South Missouri.
Any idea what started CWD or where this came from? Raymond wants to know.
So, I mean, that's a good question. And in general, these prion diseases are very unique, and in general, we just don't know a lot about them. They exist in a number of mammal species. There's human prion diseases. There's a sheep scrapie prion disease. And the bottom line is we don't know. There's some speculation that scrapie in sheep could have been the origin of CWD, but at this point in time, researchers really don't know.
Yeah, it holds many of the same kind of properties as scrapie in that it Scrapie is really the only one of these TSCs that's transmissible amongst individuals and has that environmental contamination, but as Jasmine indicated, the true origins of it are unknown.
Okay, Jasmine, Paul wants to know, is the independent lab we're using to run the 20,000 samples, are they on point to handle all those, and how quickly will hunters get results?
That is an excellent question. So it is going to take a little bit of time for any lab to process that many samples. The lab that we're working with this year, which is Colorado State University, we have a contract with them. They're beefing up staff. They're ready for all these samples. We are telling hunters that they will be able to access those results within 4 to 6 weeks. So that's about as fast as the lab could process, or any lab for that matter, given that volume. You know, we do send those samples off relatively quickly after we get them, and we get results back periodically. So if you're very concerned about those results, I encourage you to start checking that website a week or two after you submit them, but note that it can take up to 4 to 6 weeks.
Okay.
I think the important part of that too to add, Joe, is that if we get a positive test result, we do make individual contact with the hunter that took the animal. So that has occurred and will continue to occur. And so if anything comes up, you will know from us, hopefully before you log into the website and find a positive test result. That should not happen.
So what happens if a hunter does harvest a CWD deer? Dean wants to know. Would you be able to get a replacement tag to harvest another?
Yeah, so as Jasmine indicated, it's going to take us 4 to 6 weeks to get most of the test results. And so in most situations, we don't have the ability to, reissue somebody a permit in time for us having gotten the test results.
Okay, and Mark wants to know, can CWD infect a deer after it's dead? And I think he means, for example, so when you take it to a processor, and the processor butchers the infected deer, are other deer that come in after that in danger of getting infected? Or more so, I guess, the meat of those deer?
Yeah, so that really comes down to a question of the processing technique. One of the things that folks have tended to shy away from is cutting through the brain, cutting through the spinal cord. Most processing procedures remove most of the lymphatic tissue, and so even if a positive one was to go through a meat processor, the actual material that contains the vast majority of the prions is usually taken out of those animals as part of the normal cleaning process. So the risk there is relatively low, and we go back to the point that there's no evidence the disease is transmissible to humans, and so the risk there even is relatively low.
Okay.
Yeah, so for that reason, the test really is not a food safety test.
Okay, Rocky wanted to know if we can get back to this question you answered before. He may have some timing issues for getting his deer checked, so there will be extended hours for CWD sampling. I know it goes from 7 a.m. to 8 p.m. That's Saturday and Sunday, so what if somebody can't get there again?
Yeah, so we've got 75 stations. We've tried to do what we can to accommodate and make those least as accessible to folks as possible. I can't recall the exact number, but I think 80 or 90% of the counties are within 10 or 15 miles of a sampling location. So we've done everything we can to try to optimize that. And yeah, extenuating circumstances, if something happens and you can't make it to one of the sampling locations, we plan to be there till at least 8 o'clock, but we'll be there as long as there are still deer coming. And so if you can't make it, call the agent, explain the circumstance to them, and I think everything will be fine.
Okay, thank you. Justin wants to know, what's the proper process of carcass disposal for deer taken in the containment zone? So how does someone properly dispose of a carcass?
Sure. The best advice, the gold standard would be to leave the carcass lay, leave as many pieces behind as you can, especially those parts that accumulate the prions. We realize not everybody is able to do that, so if you are moving the carcass or pieces of the carcass, the best option would be to take them to a landfill if you have a landfill that accepts animal parts. Going down from there, if that's not an option, your last best option would be to bury it as deep as you can so that carcass is limited in scattering through predators and such. But note that burying is not necessarily gonna stop the spread of CWD. There's still chances that carcass could spread it.
Scott, we're getting back to a question here from Scott. So what's happened to the value of recreational hunting properties in other states that have been through this? Any ideas or?
Yeah, that's a question we often get. The information there is relatively limited. Folks in most places are still continuing to hunt. It'll be really interesting to see what happens in states like Wisconsin, where it's the establishment of the disease is starting to get to the point where it's likely to have some real long-term population level impacts, and there's no question that it could impact the recreational value of a property. But yeah, at this point in time, we don't have really any idea what that impact might be.
Yeah, I guess I would add that it's just important to remember that this disease does spread very, very slowly. So even though it's relatively rare in the state at this point in time, the long-term consequences, decades down the road, our children and grandchildren's hunting opportunities are at stake here. So that's why we're taking it so seriously.
Okay. Randy wants to know, looking in other states that are dealing with this disease, is there any long-term management strategy that's showing to be effective in reversing the spread of it? Is there hope?
Well, I think the hope is early detection. We say, well, we've only found 33. We've only found 33, and that's because of our history of testing, of our diligence in the area, of the work and cooperation with landowners in the core areas, particularly in Macon County, that have been willing to sacrifice us coming in and them removing additional deer, or us removing additional deer. And so Illinois has been a pretty good model of showing some long-term successes in terms of limiting the proportion of the population that has the disease. New York and Minnesota can show evidence of, if you get to it really early, you may find one or two positives. You remove those from the landscape, you prevent them from spreading the disease to other animals, so there is some opportunity. And I think, again, a lot of this gets back to the intensity of the sampling we're planning to do, the willingness of folks when we find a positive to allow us to come in and remove additional deer from those social groups after the hunting season is the real key here to having some long-term success. We detected the disease way, way earlier in stages of outbreaks compared to a place like Wisconsin, which the disease had a much broader geographic distribution than what we see.
Okay, Paul wants to know, can CWD be vectored to other parts of the state by avian species feeding on infected carcasses? So there's a carcass in the woods, crows and other birds eat on that, fly somewhere else. Can that help spread the disease?
Well, the research would suggest that, yes, the prions can pass through the gut and still be infectious. So the distance at which that could be moved across the landscape would be the time from consumption until the time at which that is excreted out the other end of the avian scavenger or a carnivorous scavenger. So the reality of it is that there's probably very, very few prions in that material. And so the likelihood of that being a source of spreading the disease across the landscape is pretty low. I'd far more be concerned about the dispersal of a yearling buck or a button buck out of one of our core areas, or somebody dumping a carcass somewhere than a vulture or a crow scavenging on a carcass and flying somewhere else.
And again, we talked, it's, from what we know, spread directly from deer to deer. It's about the concentration and the levels of the prion in the environment. So lower levels, less risk, though still possible.
Yeah.
Would that be correct?
Right.
Yeah, and basically, I mean, based on the slow spread of this disease, it really is indicative that this local deer-to-deer contact is spreading the disease, and any other transmission is not as important.
Okay, Brad wants some math here. So he wants to know, what's the percentage of deer in Missouri that have tested positive for CWD?
33 divided by 51,000.
Okay, so we've tested about 51,000 since 2002. Within the last few years, we have found 33 free-ranging deer and 11 captive deer. So, I mean, folks can do their math. And that's also, we have about 1.2 guesstimate million deer in the state. Yeah. So another question.
Well, the related to that is, if we look at the more appropriate question is where the disease is. what percentage of those animals have tested positive. And so the place where we've had the disease or known the disease was there the longest is that core area in Macon County. And we're in the neighborhood of 2 or 3% of those animals testing positive for the disease. And that's been very stable since we first detected the disease in 2012. We're not seeing out of that spot, we're not seeing a huge increase in prevalence yet or a big change in the distribution. And part of that, I think, is because, again, we've been very active in removing additional animals from the landscape up there.
So this ties in. Josh wants to know, you've kind of answered this. So Josh wants to know, how concerned should Missourians be about chronic wasting disease? Is our deer herd going to be wiped out?
That's a question of the time scale at which you ask it, honestly. In the short term, no. With active and aggressive management, with willingness, participation of landowners and hunters, there is an opportunity here for us to limit the spread of the disease and limit its long-term progression. But there is no question that once the disease becomes established, once it becomes ingrained within the population, it increases in prevalence, it increases in distribution, and it will eventually get to a point where the mortality associated with the disease is completely unsustainable. And unless we're active and aggressive in trying to eliminate it off the landscape, then the long term here could be rather significant to the deer herd.
Okay. So Dwayne wants to know, how likely is it that CWD is not a natural event? His example is, could Mother Nature be creating it to control the population?
Yeah, and that one gets back to, is it a question of, has it always been here? Is it something new? It does appear that CWD is something relatively new within deer and elk and moose, and so that's what raises the questions of what's its origins. But the epidemiology of the disease traces everything back to northeastern Colorado, southeastern Wyoming, the spread of it through the free-ranging populations, the spread of it through captive deer and elk that have contributed to this change in geographic distribution we're seeing over time. Had it been here or been sort of more natural in the long term, all the testing has been done over the last couple of decades would have found a very different pattern of distribution of the disease. So the trajectory of it and the pattern of spread, it makes it appear as if it's something relatively new. I mean, since 1960, that
right.
really is relatively new when we talk about evolutionary history and the way things spread.
Jasmine, Scott wants to know, is it possible, and we talked about this, explain it again if you would, from Scott, is it possible for the prion or prion to go from the host to the ground to a plant and then be ingested by another deer?
So there is a lot of research out on plant uptake right now that's out there, and it has been demonstrated that plants can take up these abnormal prions. It's also been demonstrated in the lab that these prions are likely in a form that is transmissible, but the verdict is kind of out there of what the long-term outcome of that is.
Okay, and our last question, Dean wants to know, would you see any signs of the disease inside the deer?
Generally speaking, no. Besides, if the animal is to the point that it's showing clinical symptoms, you know, you're looking at that general bad body condition, but there's no internal lesions that are indicative of the disease. Okay.
Yeah, that neurodegenerative part of it basically inhibits their motor function, and so they lose the ability to forage. These animals, the wasting part of it is starvation, frankly. Their inability to forage.
They can't. They don't know how to eat. So it's kind of just riddles their brain and...
Yeah, it's not like cancerous tumors or pus pockets or
right.
anything like that we would see inside of the animal.
Okay. We'll take one more question. We talked about these prions, and they are tough. They are tough proteins. So what conditions can the prions endure and survive, and how long can they exist in the environment?
They are extremely robust, unfortunately, being that it's not a living organism like a bacteria or virus. They're really not susceptible to degradation from environmental conditions. So the short answer is they can persist in the environment for years.
Okay, thank you. And folks, believe it or not, our hour is about up. So again, I want to thank Jasmine and Jason for being here and for bringing your expertise.
Thanks, Joe. It's an important topic. It's one we're tremendously concerned about in terms of the impacts it could have to a resource that millions of Missourians value greatly. So thanks for the time.
All right. Jasmine, any parting thought?
Thanks, Joe, and I just would extend my thanks to all the participants out there for being interested in this disease and learning more about it.
And again, I concur. Thank you to our Wild Webcast participants. We hope that you found today's Wild Webcast helpful. Again, learn more through our website at mdc.mo.gov/CWD. You can also watch previous Wild Webcasts on our website, and this one will be available there also. So thank you again for joining us, and we will offer more MDC Wild Webcasts in 2017. Y'all have a great evening now.